The city of Knoxville, Tennessee, January 6, 2007. A crisp winter evening that should have been filled with laughter and joy. Instead, it would become the beginning of one of the most haunting cases in Tennessee history. Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom were the kind of couple that made others believe in love. She was a 21-year-old sociology student at the University of Tennessee, known for her radiant smile and passionate dedication to helping others. He was a 23-year-old carpenter whose warm personality and genuine kindness touched everyone he met. They had only been dating for 2 months, but those who knew them said they were perfect for each other. That Saturday night, they planned to attend a friend's party, a simple evening that would tragically become their last. Before we continue with their story, I have a question for you in the comments. Have you ever had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, but ignored it? That small voice that tries to warn us? Share your experiences below. Your story might help someone else trust their instincts. Channon had spent the afternoon at her best friend's apartment, getting ready for the evening ahead. Chris picked her up later, and witnesses would later recall seeing them share an affectionate moment in the parking lot, unaware that these precious seconds of happiness were being watched by predators lurking in the shadows. If you're finding this story as compelling as it is heartbreaking, please consider subscribing to True Crime Watch HD. We're dedicated to sharing these important stories with the respect and attention they deserve. What happened in the next few hours would shock not just Knoxville, but the entire nation. 5 individuals, Lemaricus Davidson, Letalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd, were about to commit acts so heinous that even seasoned law enforcement officers would struggle to process the scene. Let's step back for a moment and look at who Channon and Chris were before their paths crossed with evil. Born in Nacogdoches, Texas, in 1985, Channon was the eldest child in a loving family. Her parents, Gary and Dina Christian, raised her with strong values of kindness and resilience. After moving to Knoxville in 1997, she quickly became known as a star student at Farragut High School, balancing academic excellence with a dedication to community service. Chris, born and raised in Knoxville, was the kind of person who lit up every room he entered. A talented baseball player at Halls High School, he carried that same determination into his career as a carpenter. His family and friends described him as someone who would drop everything to help others, always putting the needs of those he loved before his own. As darkness fell on that January evening, Channon and Chris were approached at gunpoint in the parking lot. Their captors forced them into Shannon's Toyota 4Runner, beginning a nightmare that would last for hours. Neither of them could have known that their final acts would be of extraordinary courage, facing unimaginable horror with a strength that would later move investigators to tears. The vehicle headed toward a small house on Chipman Street, a location that would soon become synonymous with one of Tennessee's darkest chapters. Inside that house, evil waited. But before we reveal the full horror of what transpired there, we need to understand the 5 individuals who orchestrated this tragedy, their backgrounds, their motivations, and the path that led them to commit these unconscionable acts. The hours following Channon and Chris's abduction would reveal the true depths of human cruelty. But to understand the full scope of this tragedy, we need to examine the 5 individuals who committed these heinous acts, and how their paths led to that fatal night on Chipman Street. Lemaricus Davidson, the ringleader, was no stranger to violence. Born in Memphis, Tennessee, his life was a pattern of escalating criminality. By the time he arrived in Knoxville in late 2006, he had already served time for aggravated robbery and carjacking. But his release from prison in August 2006 wasn't a story of rehabilitation. It was merely a prelude to even darker acts. The house on Chipman Street, where Davidson lived, would become ground zero for this horrific crime. It was a small, unassuming structure that gave no indication of the evil that would unfold within its walls. But for Davidson, it was the perfect location, isolated enough to commit unspeakable acts, yet close enough to civilization to avoid suspicion. His half-brother, Letalvis Cobbins, shared more than just blood with Davidson. He shared a history of violence. Having moved to Knoxville at Davidson's invitation, Cobbins brought with him a criminal record from New York, including attempted robbery. The brothers' reunion in Knoxville wasn't a heartwarming family story. It was the convergence of two predators. George Thomas, known on the streets as Detroit, was the third piece of this tragic puzzle. His journey from Michigan to Tennessee would prove fatal for our victims. While he would later claim to be merely present during the crimes, evidence would tell a different story, one of active participation in acts that would shock even hardened investigators. Perhaps the most puzzling figure in this group was Vanessa Coleman. The youngest of the perpetrators, she came from a relatively stable family in Kentucky. Her involvement would later raise disturbing questions about how someone could witness such cruelty and not only fail to stop it but participate in it. Her journal entries, discovered later, would reveal a chilling disconnect from the gravity of her actions. Eric Boyd, the fifth member of this group, was a career criminal whose involvement would take years to fully uncover. His role in the events would initially be downplayed, but time and justice would eventually reveal the full extent of his participation. As January 6th turned into January 7th, the nightmare at Chipman Street continued. Chris Newsom endured torture that would haunt investigators for years to come. The details of his final hours reveal both the depths of human depravity and his incredible courage in the face of unimaginable horror. The perpetrators subjected Chris to savage beatings and sexual assault. Bound, gagged, and blindfolded, he was then forced to walk barefoot in freezing temperatures to nearby railroad tracks. There, in the cold darkness of a Tennessee winter night, Chris faced his final moments with a bravery that would later move hardened detectives to tears. The criminals executed him with multiple gunshots, including a final shot to the head. But their cruelty didn't end there. They set his body on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence, a final indignity that would only fuel investigators' determination to bring them to justice. Meanwhile, back at the house on Chipman Street, Channon Christian's ordeal continued. 4 hours, she endured unspeakable torture and sexual assault. The perpetrator's attempts to destroy evidence by pouring bleach on her body and into her mouth showed a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even veteran prosecutors. Here's something to consider, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How do communities recover from crimes like this? What can we do to ensure these tragic stories lead to positive change in our justice system? Your insights might help others grappling with similar questions. As Sunday morning dawned, both families began to worry. Calls went unanswered. Text messages remained unread. The party where Channon and Chris were expected never saw them arrive. The first rays of sunlight brought only growing dread as both sets of parents began reaching out to friends, desperately seeking information about their children's whereabouts. The discovery of Chris's body by a railroad worker would break the case open, but in the cruelest way possible. The scene was horrific. His body burned, showing clear signs of torture and execution-style murder. For Hugh and Mary Newsom, the notification of their son's death was the beginning of a nightmare from which they would never fully wake. The search for Channon intensified. Her Toyota 4Runner was found abandoned, providing investigators with their first real break in the case. Inside, they discovered items that didn't belong to her, cigarettes and fingerprints that would later be crucial in identifying the perpetrators. But it was the search of the Chipman Street house that would reveal the full horror of this crime. There, in the kitchen, investigators made a discovery that would haunt them forever. Channon's body, bound and wrapped in trash bags, had been placed in a trash can. The medical examiner would later reveal that she had been alive when placed there, suffering a slow and agonizing death by asphyxiation. The discoveries at the railroad tracks and the Chipman Street house weren't just crime scenes. They were the beginning of a complex investigation that would take years to fully unravel, involving multiple jurisdictions, numerous law enforcement agencies, and a community desperate for justice. The discovery of Chris Newsom's body near the railroad tracks and Channon Christian's remains in the Chipman Street house launched one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Knoxville's history. But for the detectives assigned to the case, this was more than just another investigation. It was a race against time to capture 5 killers before they could flee beyond reach. The first 48 hours after discovering the bodies were crucial. Investigators worked around the clock, processing 2 separate crime scenes that would yield vital evidence. The railroad tracks where Chris's body was found told a story of unimaginable cruelty, but they also provided investigators with their first real breaks in the case. Shell casings found near Chris's body would later match a weapon connected to Lemaricus Davidson. Trace evidence, including fibers and DNA, would create a forensic web that would eventually entangle all 5 perpetrators. But it was the Chipman Street house that would become the epicenter of the investigation. This unassuming rental property, just large enough to contain 3 small bedrooms and a kitchen, had become a chamber of horrors. As crime scene technicians methodically worked through each room, they uncovered a tsunami of evidence that would prove crucial in securing convictions. The house yielded fingerprints, DNA evidence, and personal belongings of both victims. Investigators discovered Chris's shoes, still muddy from his final walk to the railroad tracks. They found Shannon's camera, which contained photos taken just hours before the abduction, final moments of happiness frozen in time. Each piece of evidence told part of a story that investigators were desperate to piece together. The manhunt for the killers began in earnest. Lemaricus Davidson's fingerprints, found in Shannon's Toyota 4Runner, provided investigators with their first named suspect. But Davidson had already fled the Chipman Street house, triggering a massive search operation that would span multiple states. The investigation revealed that Davidson and his half-brother, Letalvis Cobbins, had separated after the murders, with Cobbins and George Thomas fleeing to Lebanon, Kentucky. Meanwhile, Vanessa Coleman had returned to her family home, seemingly believing she could distance herself from the horrific crimes she had witnessed and participated in. The breakthrough came when investigators received a tip about Davidson's whereabouts. He was found hiding in an abandoned house in Knoxville, less than a mile from the crime scene. His capture was dramatic. Davidson had wedged himself into a small crawl space, but law enforcement's determination to bring him to justice proved stronger than his desire to evade capture. During his initial interrogation, Davidson attempted to paint himself as an innocent bystander, but the evidence told a different story. His DNA was found on both victims. His fingerprints were discovered throughout the Chipman Street house and in Shannon's vehicle. The weapon used to kill Chris was linked to him through ballistic evidence. Each piece of forensic evidence tightened the noose around Davidson's neck. The arrests of Cobbins and Thomas in Kentucky came next. U.S. Marshals, working in conjunction with local law enforcement, tracked the pair to a house where they had been hiding. Their capture was less dramatic than Davidson's, but no less significant. Both men were found with evidence linking them to the crimes, including personal items belonging to the victims. Vanessa Coleman's arrest followed shortly after. Initially, she attempted to position herself as another victim, claiming she had been held against her will at the Chipman Street house. However, her story quickly unraveled when investigators discovered her journal entries describing her time in Knoxville as an adventure. The disconnect between her written words and the horrific reality of what transpired would later shock jurors. Here's a question that many of our viewers might be wrestling with. How do we as a society balance the need for justice with the importance of understanding what drives people to commit such heinous acts? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might help others grappling with this difficult question. The arrest of Eric Boyd would prove to be the final piece of the puzzle, though his full involvement wouldn't be revealed for years. Initially charged as an accessory after the fact, Boyd's role in the actual kidnapping and murders would only come to light through subsequent investigations and testimony from his co-defendants. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events, the full horror of what transpired became clear. The abduction hadn't been random. The perpetrators had watched Channon and Chris in the parking lot, targeting them in a calculated act of predation. The subsequent torture and murders showed a level of cruelty that shocked even veteran detectives. The evidence-gathering process was painstaking and comprehensive. Crime scene technicians spent days processing the Chipman Street house, collecting over 800 pieces of evidence. They gathered DNA samples, fingerprints, fiber evidence, and documented blood spatter patterns throughout the house. Each piece of evidence would later become crucial in securing convictions. Among the most disturbing discoveries were the attempts to destroy evidence. The perpetrators had tried to clean the crime scene with bleach, but forensic techniques were able to reveal bloodstains and DNA evidence despite these efforts. They had burned Chris's body and disposed of Channon in trash bags, but these desperate attempts to cover their tracks only served to demonstrate the calculated nature of their crimes. The investigation also revealed the movements of the perpetrators in the days following the murders. Security camera footage showed them using the victims' credit cards. Cell phone records placed them at key locations during the critical time period. Witness statements began to fill in the gaps, creating a comprehensive timeline of events that would prove devastating in court. As the investigation phase drew to a close, prosecutors began preparing for what would become a series of lengthy and emotional trials. The evidence was overwhelming, but ensuring justice for Channon and Chris would require careful preparation and unwavering dedication from the prosecution team. The trials of those responsible for the murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom would become some of the most complex and emotionally charged legal proceedings in Tennessee history. Over the course of several years, multiple courtrooms would hear testimony that would bring hardened law enforcement officers to tears and shake the foundations of the Knoxville community. The first to face justice was Lemaricus Davidson, the accused ringleader. His trial began in October 2009, nearly 3 years after the murders. The courthouse was packed with spectators, media, and family members of both victims. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as prosecutors laid out their case against the man they described as the architect of these horrific crimes. The evidence presented against Davidson was overwhelming. Prosecutors methodically walked the jury through DNA evidence found on both victims, fingerprints discovered throughout the Chipman Street house and in Channon's vehicle, and ballistic evidence linking him to the weapon used to kill Chris. But it was the testimony about the victim's final hours that would prove most devastating. Medical experts detailed the extreme torture both victims endured. The jury learned how Chris had been beaten, raped, and forced to walk barefoot to his death. They heard how Channon had been repeatedly assaulted over many hours before being stuffed into trash bags while still alive. The medical examiner's testimony was so graphic that several jurors had to request breaks to compose themselves. Davidson's defense team attempted to shift blame to his co-defendants, arguing that while he was present, he wasn't the primary perpetrator. This strategy would ultimately fail. After hearing all the evidence, the jury took less than 4 hours to return with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Davidson was sentenced to death, becoming the first of the perpetrators to face the ultimate punishment. The trial of Letalvis Cobbins followed. Unlike his half-brother, Cobbins admitted to some involvement in the crimes, but claimed his participation was limited and coerced by Davidson. His defense strategy centered on portraying himself as a reluctant participant who feared his more dominant half-brother. However, the physical evidence told a different story. DNA evidence linked Cobbins directly to the sexual assault of Channon Christian. Witness testimony placed him as an active participant in the carjacking and subsequent events. The jury found him guilty of multiple counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. If you're finding value in this detailed examination of true crime investigation, consider subscribing to True Crime Watch HD. We believe in honoring victims by ensuring their stories are told with the depth and respect they deserve. George Thomas's trial presented unique challenges for prosecutors. While there was less physical evidence linking him directly to the murders, testimony from other defendants and witnesses placed him at the scene throughout the entire ordeal. The prosecution argued that his presence and failure to prevent the crimes or seek help made him equally culpable. The jury heard how Thomas had sat in the house, smoking cigarettes and watching television while Channon Christian was being tortured in the next room. This apparent indifference to human suffering would prove damning. Thomas was found guilty and initially sentenced to life without parole. However, in a later development that would shock many, his sentence would be reduced to 50 years in exchange for testimony against Eric Boyd. Vanessa Coleman's trial proved to be one of the most controversial. As the only female defendant, her role in the crimes sparked intense debate. The prosecution presented evidence that Coleman had not only witnessed the crimes, but had actively participated in the torture of Channon Christian. Her journal entries, in which she described her time in Knoxville during the period of the murders as an adventure, horrified the jury. The defense attempted to portray Coleman as another victim, trapped in the house with violent men. However, this narrative crumbled under the weight of evidence showing she had multiple opportunities to seek help or escape. Initially sentenced to 53 years, Coleman would face a retrial in 2013 after the original trial judge faced legal troubles of his own. Her sentence was reduced to 35 years, a decision that would spark outrage in the community. The final defendant to face justice was Eric Boyd, but his path to conviction would be the longest and most complex. Initially charged only as an accessory after the fact in federal court, Boyd received an 18-year sentence in 2008. However, investigators never stopped building their case against him for direct involvement in the crimes. It wasn't until 2019, 12 years after the murders, that Boyd would finally face state charges for his role in the kidnapping, torture, and murders. The breakthrough came when George Thomas agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. Thomas's testimony, combined with new evidence and analysis of old evidence, painted Boyd as an active participant in the crimes rather than a mere accessory. The jury heard compelling testimony about Boyd's involvement in the initial carjacking and his direct participation in the torture and murder of Chris Newsom. After years of evading full responsibility, Boyd was finally found guilty of first-degree murder, receiving 2 life sentences plus 90 years. Throughout all the trials, the families of Channon Christian and Chris Newsom showed remarkable strength and dignity. They attended every hearing, every trial, forcing themselves to listen to the horrific details of their children's final hours. Their unwavering presence served as a reminder of the human cost of these crimes and the importance of securing justice. The impact of these trials extended far beyond the courtroom. They exposed weaknesses in the justice system, sparked discussions about the nature of evil, and forced the community to confront difficult questions about violence and accountability. But most importantly, they ensured that those responsible for the deaths of 2 innocent young people would never again walk free. The convictions of all 5 perpetrators brought some measure of closure to the families of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, but the impact of this case continues to reverberate through Knoxville and beyond. The brutal murders of these 2 young people forever changed how this community viewed itself and sparked changes that would affect Tennessee's criminal justice system for years to come. The Christian and Newsom families emerged from the trials forever altered. Gary and Dina Christian, Shannon's parents, transformed their grief into advocacy. They became vocal proponents for victims' rights in Tennessee, pushing for legislation that would give victims' families more rights during criminal proceedings. Their efforts led to significant changes in how the state handles death penalty cases and victims' family notifications. Hugh and Mary Newsom, Chris's parents, channeled their pain into creating lasting memorials for their son. They established scholarships in Chris's name at Halls High School, ensuring that his legacy would live on through education. The baseball field where Chris once played now bears his name, a reminder of the promising young man whose life was cut tragically short. The case exposed serious flaws in Tennessee's judicial system. The original trial judge's legal troubles, which led to some convictions being temporarily questioned, sparked a reform movement within the state's judiciary. New protocols were established for selecting replacement judges, and stricter oversight measures were implemented to prevent similar issues in the future. If you're finding value in our detailed coverage of these important cases, please consider subscribing to True Crime Watch HD. Your support helps us continue sharing these stories that need to be told. The Chipman Street house, once a scene of unimaginable horror, became a symbol of the community's determination to prevent similar tragedies. After standing empty for years, a decision was made to demolish it. The demolition day drew hundreds of community members, many of whom had never known Channon or Chris personally, but felt connected to their story. The vacant lot was later transformed into a memorial garden, a place of peace and reflection rising from the ashes of tragedy. The case also led to changes in how law enforcement agencies coordinate their responses to violent crimes. The successful multi-agency investigation that brought the perpetrators to justice became a model for future collaborations. Training programs were developed to help different departments work together more effectively in crisis situations. The media coverage of the murders sparked intense debates about how such crimes are reported and discussed. The case received varying levels of national attention, leading to discussions about which stories make headlines and why. These conversations continue today, influencing how journalists approach coverage of violent crimes and their impact on communities. In the years following the trials, annual remembrance walks have been organized in Knoxville. These events, which draw thousands of participants, serve multiple purposes: honoring the memories of Channon and Chris, raising awareness about violent crime, and bringing the community together in solidarity against violence. The walks often end with candlelight vigils where stories are shared, and new generations learn about the importance of remaining vigilant and supporting one another. The Christian and Newsom families have shown remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. They've become advocates for other families affected by violent crime, offering support and guidance through the complex legal process they know all too well. Their strength has inspired countless others to become more involved in their communities and to speak out against violence. The impact on Knoxville's law enforcement community was profound and lasting. Many officers who worked the case have spoken about how it changed them personally and professionally. Training programs now include lessons learned from this investigation, ensuring that future generations of law enforcement officers are better prepared to handle complex, high-profile cases. The case also led to the creation of new support systems for law enforcement officers and first responders who deal with traumatic crime scenes. Recognition of the psychological impact on these professionals has resulted in expanded mental health services and counseling options. These resources have become vital tools in helping those who serve and protect process the darker aspects of their work. In Tennessee's law schools and criminal justice programs, the case has become a crucial teaching tool. Students study not only the investigative techniques that led to the convictions, but also the legal complexities that emerged during the trials. The case has influenced how future lawyers and law enforcement officers are trained, emphasizing the importance of thorough investigation and meticulous evidence handling. The legacy of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom lives on through the lives they touched and the changes their tragic deaths inspired. Their story has become a reminder of both the darkness that can exist in our world and the light that communities can create when they stand together against violence. Today, survivors of violent crime in Tennessee have more resources and support than ever before, thanks in part to advocacy inspired by this case. Crisis response teams are better trained, victim support services are more comprehensive, and the legal system is more attuned to the needs of victims' families. As we conclude our examination of this case, we must remember that behind the headlines, court proceedings, and legal reforms were two young people full of promise and possibility. Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom represented the best of their community. Kind, hard-working individuals whose lives were cut tragically short. Their story reminds us that the fight for justice never ends, and that each of us has a role to play in preventing such tragedies from happening again. Their memories live on not just in the hearts of their families and friends, but in the countless lives touched by the changes their story inspired. The true measure of their legacy isn't just in the reforms and improvements their deaths catalyzed, but in the ongoing commitment of their community to ensure such a tragedy never happens again. We honor them not just by remembering their story, but by working to create a world where such senseless violence becomes increasingly rare. Their lives, though cut short, continue to make a difference through the changes they inspired and the people they touched.